Okay, let's see if we can share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that okay. So first of all, thanks for having me back. I always enjoy giving a presentation for ASSAP, so it's nice to be here. Today I want to talk about qualitative psychical research, which is something that I've been sort of thinking about, well, throughout all of my work on the paranormal, really, but especially recently trying to bring together lots of different strands of my thinking, my research, and my own experience doing research as well, as well as my teaching. So this is my first attempt really at bringing all these strands together, so it might be a little bit rambling. So in an effort to try and make it streamlined and to try and, fix it up for myself, I've split it up into 6 parts. The first part deals with ideas to do with subjectivities, cosmologies, worldviews. What are they? This idea that there is something sort of invisible in human beings that we can research as sort of social scientists. Then I'm going to think about 2 dominant approaches to doing research in the Western academic tradition, and they are positivism and interpretivism. And then I'm going to zoom in on some of the hard problems, the hard problems of consciousness, which are actually embedded within these issues. Okay, so we'll see that actually, the research choices that we make, whether we're approaching research as a positivist or an interpretivist, for example, are also associated with deeper kinds of philosophical questions. Once we've got all of that groundwork out of the way, we can start to think about how we can bring these issues to bear on the question of psychical research and parapsychology. And we'll also think about how these different research traditions have actually played out within this field. And then finally, we'll actually think about what we mean by qualitative psychical research, or what qualitative psychical research could be. And some of the different formulations of qualitative psychical research that there actually already are. And then in the beyond section, this is a kind of a slightly more experimental part of the presentation, but I want to think about other alternative frameworks for conducting research in this, which are present within the social sciences, but which might also be brought into psychical research and parapsychology. And in particular, there are 2 things that I want to think about. One is surrealist research methods. So this is coming from 20th century, surrealism. And the second thing I want to consider is the possibility of bringing indigenous research methods into psychical research. Okay, so anyway, we'll get to all of that later on. So let's jump in. So the first part, cosmologies, worldviews, and subjectivities. So what is it that we study when we're studying human beings, and the things that they believe, the things that they've experienced, and all that kind of stuff? Okay, so Nick Campion, Professor Nicholas Campion at the Sophia Centre, University of Wales, where I work, suggests that we can make a distinction between different kinds of cosmologies. So we can talk about a scientific cosmology, which would be sort of, like the stuff that you do in astronomy, empirical research on the cosmos. And then we can also talk about anthropological cosmologies, which are different kinds of worldviews. Okay, so he explains, anthropological cosmologies are based on the proposition that ideas about the cosmos are an integral part of human cultural and social systems. So he's saying that all human cultures, all societies, build their own kinds of models of the cosmos. And these differ from one tradition to another, from one culture to another. And we could even say, and this is what we'll go on to later on, is that every individual person has their own kind of cosmological model, their own way of positioning themselves in the world. Fiona Bowie gives another useful definition of a cosmology as a theory or conception of the nature of the universe and its workings, and of the place of human beings and other creatures within that order. Okay, so you can see that every culture has their own cosmological model, but then subcultures may have their own, and even individual people may have their own models of how the world works. Okay, so we could say that we're talking about, when we're researching people's beliefs and experiences and their interpretations of those experiences, that we're researching their cosmologies. the way that they make sense of the world, structure it and organize it in their conceptual framework. Okay, so obviously there are many different cosmologies then. Okay, so we can say, empirical science might say there is one cosmology, which is the thing that physics and astrophysics and all that kind of stuff investigates. Social scientists might say, actually, there are many cosmologies. There are many different views of the world, different interpretations and understandings of how all of this stuff actually works and fits together, and our place within that. This is really clear when it comes to language. Obviously, languages are culturally kind of conditioned or created, cultural constructs, essentially. But they shape the way that we experience and understand the world. So the linguist Benjamin Lee Whorf famously put forward this hypothesis, sometimes called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that we experience the world filtered through our conceptual categories. Okay, so it's just as it's possible to have any number of geometries other than the Euclidean, which give an equally perfect account of space configurations, so it's possible to have descriptions of the universe, all equally valid, that do not contain our familiar contrasts of time and space. Okay, so he's saying that, there are many different ways of looking at the world, and we shouldn't necessarily expect all of these different ways to adhere to our way of looking at the world. Yeah? And just as he's saying in geometry, you can use Euclidean geometry to make accurate predictions, where he's saying, so you can use other forms of geometry to make accurate predictions. So they're actually all equally kind of practical. Yeah. Okay. So the important point here is that anyway, that our modes, our models of the universe and the way that we understand it and the way that we think about it impact the way that we behave in the world. The things that we do, the behaviors that we perform and exhibit. And these can be positive or negative worldviews, really. The anthropologist Roy Rappaport says that, or suggests that, that our cosmological models can be positive or negative. We can impact the environment, for example, negatively if we have a worldview that suggests that the environment is for our consumption. Okay, so he says nature is seen by humans through a screen of beliefs, knowledge, and purposes. And it's in terms of their images of nature. So this is what we're talking about as our cosmologies, the pictures of the world that cultures build, rather than of the actual structure of nature that they act. They act through their cultural models, but they act on the real world, and it's nature itself that acts upon them, nurturing or destroying them. So these ideas that we have about the world are really kind of fundamental. They impact the way that we behave in the world, the way that we understand other people around us, and all of these kinds of things. But obviously, they're not just cultural or linguistic models. They're not something that comes from the top down, that's kind of just given to us. And like I've already hinted at, they're also personal models, and they're influenced by sort of bottom-up processes. So by experiential processes, for instance. So an individual person, although they may be given a cultural model from the top down, they might in fact build up their own model of the cosmos based on their own experiences from the bottom up. Okay, so these are sometimes referred to as folk models or folk cosmologies. Okay, so the folklorist Alan Dundas gives us a useful definition here. He says, all cultures have underlying assumptions held by members of a given culture. It's these assumptions or folk ideas which are the building blocks of worldview. Any one worldview will be based upon many individual folk ideas, and if one is seriously interested in studying worldview, one will need first to describe some of the folk ideas which contribute to the formation of that worldview. So these folk ideas can come from, small scale kind of experiences, subjective experiences as well. Okay, so in this way, or by looking at it this way, we're zooming in from the perspective of cultural models into the individual and into their own perspective on the world and their own way of making sense of it, how they understand their experiences and their place in the world. So this is kind of what William James was talking about when he talked about this concept of personal religion. Okay, so he was very interested in how religion is experienced and the phenomenology of religion. which we'll talk about later on. And in his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is probably his most famous book, we have other equally significant books, he talks about personal religion in these terms. He says personal religion refers to the feelings, acts, and experiences of individuals in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. So he's saying here that, personal religion is actually, like Fiona Bowie was talking about, our way of orienting ourselves. He's talking here specifically in relation to ideas about the divine, because he's thinking in terms of religious experience, but it could be, how we position ourselves in relation to the natural world, okay, the cosmos. So each person individually builds up their own model of the world based on their own experiences and on the cultural frameworks that are handed down to them. And just another way of formulating this, David Hay and Rebecca Nye, who did research on children's spirituality, came up with this useful definition of spirituality, which I think is kind of circling around this issue that we're looking at, which is kind of like how we make sense of our place in the cosmos. They say spirituality is the potential to be much more deeply aware of ourselves and our intimate relationship with everything that is not ourselves. So again, in this way, it's framing it as how we understand ourselves in the context of the world. So every single person will have, from this point of view, a spirituality. I think actually maybe calling it a cosmology or a worldview is better. Okay, but we all have them. This is a very inclusive view of spirituality, of course, which is quite a good thing. But I think it's better to refer to it as a worldview, maybe, or as a personal cosmology. So, how do we study personal cosmologies, worldviews, spiritualities, subjectivities, or whatever it is that we want to call it? This is where we're going to get into this. There are two main strands within Western academia of how we can approach studying these kinds of things. Okay, and they are positivism and interpretivism. So in the Western academic tradition, it's usually, any kind of research is usually positioned somewhere within this dichotomy, somewhere within, on a sort of spectrum between positivism on the one hand and interpretivism on the other. So positivist approaches work in favor of quantitative research. So that's numbers, things that we can weigh and measure, things that can be chopped up and divided, usually physical things, or numbers, which are somewhere in between. Collecting objective data that can be measured, counted, weighed, calculated, proven, repeated, all of these kinds of things that we associate with empirical science. Okay, so positivism is very much empirical in nature. It's all about finding positive evidence for the existence of phenomena. Interpretivist approaches, on the other hand, favor qualitative research. So this is to do with data that is subjective, things that can't necessarily be measured or weighed. So things like feelings, emotions, opinions, beliefs, all of these things which might constitute a worldview or a cosmology, someone's orientation within the world, from their subjective orientation. And we know from experience, don't we, that things like feelings, emotions, opinions, and beliefs are just as real as things that can be measured, counted, weighed, and calculated. Okay, they're very different kinds of things. We can't actually weigh them or measure them like that, but they nevertheless are still real and still exist. So there's also this argument, interpretivists will say that this kind of stuff that we're dealing with here, this kind of qualitative stuff, needs particular kinds of methods in order to be able to study it. And the approach that positivists bring to it might not necessarily work. You can't necessarily take a physical sample of an emotion, for example. So you need a different methodology to study that. So this is interesting when we consider it from some different perspectives, like from an indigenous perspective, for instance. And there's a growing movement within the social sciences of taking into consideration indigenous perspectives. Okay, so a whole process of decolonizing the academy. Okay, so anyway, positivists believe that it's possible to discover objective laws of cause and effect. So people like Emil Durkheim here, the founder of sociology, thought that it was possible to find laws of cause and effect for society. So he was a positivist. Okay, in the same way that we might have laws of cause and effect in physics, which is a positive science. So the ideal form of data collection from a positivist standpoint is going to be the laboratory experiment, where we can do controlled investigations and we can collect carefully measured quantitative data. In the lab, we can control variables and all of that kind of stuff. And we'll talk later about how this has impacted paranormal research. But as I was saying, from an indigenous perspective, and this is coming from Linda Tuiwai-Smith, who is a Maori scholar of research methodologies. She says, from an indigenous perspective, Western research is more than just research that is located in the positivist tradition. It's research which brings to bear on any study of indigenous peoples a cultural orientation, a set of values, a different conceptualization of such things as time, space, and subjectivity, different and competing theories of knowledge, highly specialized forms of language and structures of power. So actually, the kinds of research that Western approaches have kind of developed bring with them a lot of baggage, actually, that might not be best suited for researching, the kinds of dynamics that exist within indigenous communities, or the kinds of experiences that indigenous people might have, or more than just indigenous people as well. So we'll come on to this a bit more later on. But it's interesting to point out this issue at this juncture as well. So what she's really saying is that actually the attempt to achieve objectivity, which is the hallmark of the empirical sciences and of positivism and all that kind of thing, is itself the product of a particular cosmological and metaphysical viewpoint. Okay, so it's actually, it's a cosmological orientation in itself. It's an ontology, really. You're saying what kinds of things exist and what things don't exist. Okay, so there are actually many different ontologies. So the other framework that exists within the Western, discourse is positivism on the one hand, and then the interpretivists on the other hand. So interpretivists essentially reject the ideal that the humanities and social sciences should be modeled on the natural sciences. So they're saying that, we shouldn't be trying to make, for example, anthropology like physics, or sociology and psychology like chemistry, because, we're dealing with different kinds of phenomena, different kinds of things that require different kinds of methods. Okay, so interpretivists in general kind of see social reality as consisting of subjective meanings, lots of different kinds of subjective meanings internal to people's consciousness. And so in all different people have different beliefs and attitudes about the world. And meaning is created from the bottom up, from the individual. Okay, so cultures are kind of created by the individual, which is a kind of different way of looking at it. So we can only understand human worldviews by interpreting the meanings people give to their actions. So interpretatives say we can't just study, for example, behaviors and expect to understand what's going on. Behaviors which are objective and measurable and all of those kinds of things. We actually also need to study the beliefs, the ideas that kind of give meaning to those behaviors. I remember a great example. It was the historian of religion, John Bowker, and he wrote something about funerals, and he said, a kind of a positivist functionalist kind of view of funerals looks at them really just in terms of disposal of the dead. You know, we have to dispose of the dead. We have to get rid of it in some way. So funerals have emerged as a way to do that. But if we actually talk to the people who are engaged in a funeral, there are all sorts of other kinds of things that are not immediately obvious. So there are symbols on the you know, the symbols on the coffin and these kinds of things, or particular beliefs about reincarnation or about the afterlife and things, which inform the behaviors just as much as any kind of practical or utilitarian thing. Okay, so you can't just ignore that dimension. You have to take that into consideration too. And this is what interpretivists are saying. Okay, so it's another way of saying that. In anthropology, which has really got a strong interpretivist tradition, going right the way back to Evans Pritchard, who's kind of one of the pioneers of of modern anthropology. He says that Evans Pritchard in his work was really attempting to understand and relate the inner thoughts of his subjects. Okay, so this is where we're starting to get into the territory of how do we actually engage with and understand people's inner subjectivities. Slightly later on, Clifford Geertz actually coins this term interpretive anthropology. So he's following in the tradition of Evans Pritchard with publication of this book, The Interpretation of Cultures. And this is where we're starting to get into what makes, I think, qualitative research unique and very different to quantitative research. And this is where qualitative research actually has something important to offer parapsychology and psychical research, is in the production of thick descriptions. So Clifford Geertz basically says that ethnography, which is what anthropologists do, go into the field and you experience the field and then you write it up. Ethnography is thick description. What the ethnographer is in fact faced with is a multiplicity of complex conceptual structures, many of them superimposed upon or knotted into one another, which are at once strange, irregular, and inexplicit, and which they must contrive somehow first to grasp and then to render. So we're trying to describe in as much complexity, a thick description, all of the different processes that are going on. Okay, we'll see later on how this is kind of might relate to parapsychology and psychical research. Okay, so this is what we're doing in qualitative research then. You know, we're trying to understand these subtle complexities of the world, not necessarily the things that are immediately obvious, which, you know, behaviors and actions of people, but actually the motivations, the things that are behind people's behaviors. So in broad terms, qualitative research is an approach that allows you to examine people's experiences in detail by using a specific set of research methods, such as in-depth interviews, focus group discussions, observer content analysis, visual methods, and life histories or biographies. So these are all common kind of mainstream approaches within qualitative research for investigating and studying inner subjective worlds. Ethnography is also a qualitative approach. It's what anthropologists do, you know, going into the field, experiencing, collecting other people's experiences and writing it up. And this is what Clifford Geertz says: at the most down-to-earth jungle fieldwork levels of their activity, interviewing informants, observing rituals, eliciting kin terms, tracing property lines, censusing households, writing their journal. So these are all hallmarks of qualitative research. These are the kinds of things that qualitative researchers do, and anthropologists in particular. And these are the kinds of things that I'm going to suggest psychical research, you know, engage with a little bit more. Okay, so we're going to move into now the hard problems, because what actually is it that qualitative research, what actually is it that qualitative research collects? Okay, so it actually collects subjective experiences, narratives, and stories. Okay, so these are actually, when we begin to think about them, very precious kinds of data, ephemeral kinds of data. Okay, so this is the philosopher David Chalmers, and he's famous for, outlining basically the hard problem of consciousness. How is it that we can have subjective experiences, any kinds of experiences actually, emerging from what is essentially, from the standard perspective anyway, inert matter. So how can we have subjective experiences emerging from inert matter? And he describes these subjective experiences as qualia, which is the plural of the word quale, a unit of subjective experience, referring to the introspectively accessible phenomenal aspects of our mental lives. So this is our internal, perspective on the world. And, how do we talk about our internal perspective, the things that we experience and all that kind of stuff? We do that through stories, through sharing experiences. We construct beliefs around our experiences of the world, memories, feelings, emotions, all of these different kinds of things. This is qualitative stuff, like you just said. Okay. So I'll read this out because I think it's interesting when we start to think about all of this qualitative data that we could potentially collect in terms of the hard problem of consciousness. He says, the hard problem is the question of how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience. This puzzle involves the inner aspect of thought and perception, the way things feel for the subject. When we see, for example, we experience visual sensations such as that of vivid blue, or think of the ineffable sound of a distant oboe, the agony of an intense pain, the sparkle of happiness, or the meditative quality of a moment lost in thought, all a part of what I'm calling consciousness. It's these phenomena that pose the real mystery of the mind. And it's these phenomena that we collect when we do qualitative research. So we're operating then, we're working at the very edge, the very cutting edge really of, the Western scientific enterprise, on the very verge of the mystery of consciousness. So I think it's important to say that any kind of qualitative data that we collect is actually precious and mysterious stuff. We don't even know how experiences are possible. So when we're collecting people's experiences, we are really collecting mysteries. And I think this comes across nicely when we talk about this famous question, what is it like to be a bat? This comes from the writings of the philosopher Thomas Nagel. He wrote a very influential paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? I'll read you out a quote here. He says, most bats perceive the external world primarily by sonar or echolocation, detecting the reflections from objects within range of their own rapid, subtly modulated high-frequency shrieks. Their brains are designed to correlate the outgoing impulses with the subsequent echoes, and the information thus acquired enables bats to make precise discriminations of distance, size, shape, motion, and texture comparable to those we make by vision. But bat sonar, though clearly a form of perception, is not similar in its operation to any sense that we possess, and there is no reason to suppose that it is subjectively like anything we can experience or imagine. This appears to create difficulties for the notion of what it is like to be a bat. We must consider whether any method will permit us to extrapolate to the inner life of the bat from our own case, and if not, what alternative methods there may be for understanding the notion. Okay, so he's saying that we can actually never fully experience what it's like to be a bat because we are very different from bats. Okay, but it's a very interesting question, and perhaps there are methods that we can use that will enable us to understand, what it's like to be a bat. Okay, so there's a possibility that there might be research methods that will enable something close to that kind of thing. We can say the same thing about the inner lives of any kind of research informant or any kind of person that we interview as part of our research, that we can never actually experience what it's like to be that person. They're always going to be somewhat distant from us in some way. So we have to have the right kinds of approaches in order to break that barrier down a little bit. So actually, what is it like to be, what is it like to be a bat? What is it like to be a poltergeist experiencer? What is it like to have an out-of-body experience or whatever? Is a good starting point for any kind of qualitative research that we might do, to try to think about what it's like to essentially experience the world from a different point of view, with a different experiential inputs, different conceptualizations of the world, different models, different beliefs, and all that kind of stuff. And Edith Turner here, famous anthropologist, argued that, as researchers, we need to learn to see what the natives see. This is one of her big takeaway points, is that this is what anthropologists should be trying to do, is trying to see the world through the eyes of their informants. And, what are the implications of that for paranormal and psychical research? I'll think about that shortly. We could also blow this open even further as well and say, what about things like perspectivism, which is a worldview found in a lot of Amerindian cultures. And the idea is that, everything has its own perspective. And because everything has its own perspective, it's also possible for people like shamans in altered states to enter into the perspectives of other kinds of beings, to become jaguars and things like that. So from that kind of a cosmological model, then, what is it like to be a bat? Well, ask a shaman, because perhaps a shaman might be able to tell you. In those cosmologies, it's actually possible, it's understood to be possible to shift perspectives. Okay, so it blows the whole thing open when we start to bring in these other ways of conceptualizing these issues. Anyway, that will do us for now. Okay, so I just briefly want to talk about bracketing. So one way of that emerged in the 20th century, of trying to approach the real complexity of real life lived experience, was through a philosophical movement called phenomenology, which was basically put forward by a guy called Edmund Husserl, because he thought that philosophy had become way too abstract and it had become too distant from the world. And phenomenology then basically was proposed as a way to treat experience as experience, and to understand and to do a kind of philosophical analysis of direct experiences of things. So in a sense, he's saying that we actually can experience reality directly in some way. And he also came up with this idea of bracketing. And the principle of bracketing, or the whole point of bracketing in the first place, was to say that, we can approach the world in as neutral a way as we possibly can. We need to get rid of all of our presuppositions, and we need to get rid of asking questions about whether things are real or not, and just focus on what it is that we experience. So what things do we experience in the world? That's what we're going to analyze. But bracketing out, it started off as this approach of this method of saying, we're going to not ask questions, we're just going to treat experience as it is. But as it panned out and moved into the social sciences, it turned into a way of kind of ignoring questions about the reality of the things that you're dealing with. So of experiences, for example, or of beliefs. And this is expressed really nicely in a quotation from Evans Pritchard, who we mentioned earlier. He says, "As I understand the matter, there's no possibility of knowing whether the spiritual beings of primitive religions or of any others have any existence or not. And since that's the case, the anthropologist cannot take the question into consideration." So he put the brackets up around the question of whether spirits are real or not. And then what you do is focus on just the beliefs about spirits and the influence of those beliefs on behavior and that kind of thing. All of that becomes then what Durkheim called social facts. Okay, so it's legitimate to study that. But if you then step outside of the brackets and ask questions about whether these spirits are real or not, then from Evans Pritchard's perspective, you're moving beyond the scope of what anthropology is all about. And maybe he's right, maybe then you're moving into more kind of parapsychology. Okay. Anyway, this bracketing approach has become the dominant approach in the social sciences. And most sort of sociological, psychological studies of the paranormal will employ bracketing in order to legitimize the study. So to say that, we're not saying that this is real or not, we're just looking at the social facts. And this kind of leads to a form of relativism, where you have different systems of belief that you can't really compare against each other. But there are problems with bracketing. So, it came in as a useful tool in the early 20th century, but now that we've spent time with it, we can actually acknowledge that there are some problems with this idea of bracketing. So the sociologist Jeremy Northcott argues that there are real problems with bracketing, especially when it comes to studying things like paranormal experiences and supernatural beliefs. Okay, so this is what he says. I hold that there is a fundamental bias in bracketing approaches that arises from the fact that an analyst taking such an approach must inevitably make a decision about where to place the brackets, and hence define some aspects of supernormal belief or activity as being social in nature and the remainder as not, which is itself an ontological claim. So the point is here that, put the actual act of putting up these brackets and saying this stuff can be studied legitimately and that stuff is all nonsense is actually itself an ontological claim, which makes the work, makes the research biased. So is there a way of overcoming, this bracketing issue? It's something that I've thought about quite a lot. So one of the ways that I, in my research and my work, started to overcome this bracketing issue was to think about research from psychical research and parapsychology, which are, as we've already hinted at, interested in the objective ontological status of these phenomena. So I've drawn on these as a way to open up a space for considering the reality of the paranormal or of psi within my own research on mediumship. So a lot of you probably already know this, but I'll just go through it for completeness sake. The Society for Psychical Research was established in 1882. It's the first organization to scientifically study what we would today call the paranormal. But back in the old days, they had all sorts of different kinds of names for the paranormal. This is what they said, though. They wanted to research that large body of debatable phenomena designated by such terms as mesmeric, psychical, and spiritualistic, in the same spirit of exact and unimpassioned inquiry, which has enabled science to solve so many problems. Okay. They had different committees within the organization to research different kinds of phenomena. So things like thought transference and mesmerism, mediumship and survival, subtle energies or odic forces, apparitions and hauntings, physical phenomena, and the history of psychical experiences. One of the major achievements of the SPR was the publication of a survey of paranormal experiences in the 19th century. And this is why I'm talking about this, because the early research of the Society for Psychical Research, if we were going to just say whether it was quantitative or qualitative, we'd actually probably say that they were doing qualitative research right at the very beginning. They did survey work, and they collected narrative accounts of people's experiences using this question. Have you ever, when believing yourself to be completely awake, had a vivid impression of seeing or being touched by a living being or inanimate object, or of hearing a voice which impression, so far as you could discover, was not due to any external physical cause? So, they asked the question and then they collected people's responses. So that's a form of qualitative research. And then through this, they then thought that they could actually make ontological claims, that they had collected enough narrative accounts of these experiences to suggest that there was more to this than just, belief or illusion or anything like that, that actually there might be some kind of phenomenon behind it. Okay, and it was from this kind of research, this kind of qualitative research, that they felt like they could, conclusively say that things like telepathy existed. Okay, so it's interesting, isn't it, that qualitative research can actually potentially give rise to data that can be, used for empirical purposes as well. But things started to change at the turn of the 19th century as we moved into the 20th century. So, for the most part, the work of the SPR had been focused on spontaneous cases. So, someone had a haunting or a poltergeist or something going on, and then the SPR would be called in to investigate. Okay, so that's obviously quite sporadic, and you have very little control over the conditions within which your research can take place, because it's all field-based and it's all, spontaneous. But gradually, this had an impact on the way that the theories of psychical researchers were perceived, because experimental science was in the ascendancy. It was becoming increasingly well regarded and established as the way to do things. So, by the time you get to the, like 1920s and things, going out into the field to investigate poltergeists and that kind of thing is almost seeming a little bit outdated. You need to do your research in a laboratory. You need to be able to replicate your research. Okay. So by the early years of the 20th century, science had pretty much become synonymous with the idea of replicability and the idea of doing experiments in labs. And even emerging fields like psychology were very influenced by, physics and chemistry and all these kinds of things, and set up their own laboratories. The first psychological laboratory was established in 1879 by Wilhelm Wundt. And this really establishes the foundations for what will become, experimental parapsychology later on, as well as things like, mainstream things like behaviorism and all of that. So in an effort to bring psychical research up to date with modern lab-based methods, J.B. Rhine and his his supervisor, William McDougall, established the first parapsychology lab at Duke University in 1930. And they coined the term parapsychology, which they borrowed from the German term parapsychology, which had first been used in 1889 to distinguish this new experimental approach from psychical research, which was seen as qualitative, providing less reliable data, and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so this laboratory empirical kind of approach to paranormal research has had a huge impact on the field, obviously. And although it was, controversial and still is, it was a really important kind of point where there was a realization that actually there might be something within this that we can study empirically as well. So they identified, through these experiments, all sorts of different phenomena, which you're probably familiar with. ESP, for example, extrasensory perception, which itself contains all sorts of different kinds of phenomena: telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, retrocognition. And they also did work on psychokinesis, RSPK, which was a theory for explaining poltergeists by human agency, and all of this kind of stuff. So this is all the bread and butter kind of phenomena of experimental lab-based parapsychology. And the way that they demonstrate the existence of these phenomena is through statistics. So this was maybe J.B. Rhine's biggest contribution to paranormal research, is the use of statistics and laboratory methods for demonstrating the existence of psi, using standards that are acknowledged within the mainstream sciences, like physics and chemistry and maths. So they're no longer reliant on unreliable witness testimonies for evidence of the paranormal. You don't have to rely on qualitative data. You can actually have empirical, objective, hard data. And the Zener card guessing game is a real good example of this statistical approach. You have a pack of 5 different symbols, 5 cards of each. So there's a particular statistical chance that you'll pick them out by chance. And then anything above chance is statistically significant. Okay, so it's a simple way of suggesting an active principle. So it's very much proof focused anyway. So, even the early work of the Society of Psychical Research was proof focused too, but it was qualitative. This work is proof focused and it's quantitative. So now we want to think about qualitative psychical research. And the reason I want to think about this is because the kind of statistical stuff that we've just been talking about is very small scale. The statistical significance is only just slightly above chance, for example, which suggests that these phenomena are, at the very least, extremely kind of rare kind of things. They're not major, big things. But when people have real life paranormal experiences, real world experiences, they're kind of mind-blowing, world-shattering kind of events, often leading people to change their worldview. Okay, and this was like noted by the Italian anthropologist Ernesto Di Martino way back in the 1960s. He said, in the laboratory, the drama of the dying man who appears to a relative or friend is reduced to an oft-repeated experiment, one that tries to transmit to the mind of a subject the image of a playing card chosen at random. So he's saying that, you know, in the lab, the real complexity of real world paranormal experiences, which are enmeshed within what he calls drama, all sorts of things that are going on, social, psychological things, is ignored in the lab. And we only get these very small effects. Okay, so real life paranormal experiences are often much more phenomenologically intense than the side effects documented in the lab. So is there a way that we can research that intensity, you know, the real intensity of paranormal experiences as they play out in people's real experience, rather than these just slightly above chance statistical blips, which seem to suggest the existence of subtle processes? Okay. So actually, you know, focusing on the bigger picture, the way that these things fit into the real world lived experience of people is a much more process-focused approach, much more interested in all of the different kinds of factors that lead into and contribute to the overall extraordinary or paranormal experience. So the dramas, the social, psychological pressures, and all of that kind of good stuff. Okay, so there are ways of researching this, and there are lots of different kinds of phenomenological approaches that are already existing out there, which is all good. So when we talk about qualitative psychical research, actually, we can talk about it in the plural, because there are several different ways that we can approach qualitative psychical research. One very good way, recent influential way, is through interpretive phenomenological analysis. So you could look at, for example, the work of Elizabeth Roxburgh and Chris Rowe on mediums and their kinds of frameworks for making sense of their own experiences. Okay, that's one way that we can look at this. We can interview people. We can use use other people's narrative descriptions of their perspectives to make sense of, you know, spiritualism, for example. There's Rachel Ironside and Robin Wooffitt's kind of discourse and interactional analysis to the paranormal, thinking about the ways that we talk about the paranormal with each other, actually construct experiences as well, and the way that we interpret them. Okay, so this would be qualitative psychical research as well. There's also paranthropology, which is what I have, you know, basically called the kind of approach that I take, which is an ethnographic participant observation approach in an effort to gain an insider or a near insider perspective. So in my research on mediumship, for example, as well as collecting narratives from my informants about their own experiences, I participated in mediumship development and had my own experiences, which then helped me to interpret the experiences of my informants. Okay, so that would also be qualitative psychical research. And then there are other approaches as well, like the comparative approach. Gregory Shushan has done great comparative research on near-death experiences between and across cultures, and Jeffrey Kripal's comparative approach to religion. Okay, so these are ways of comparing qualities between different kinds of experiences or different kinds of traditions. So what I'm going to talk about next is in a related but maybe tangential direction to all of these. So it fits into and feeds into all of these things, but it's a particular strand within it that I want to focus in on for the last part of the presentation. And what I want to think about is employing a kind of comparative approach, so comparing between experiences, looking at phenomenological qualities in narrative reports collected through ethnographic participation. Okay, so going out into the world, experiencing the world engaging with people, talking with people, collecting narratives from people, and then comparing narratives for their phenomenological qualities. So a starting point for this, and for the particular kind of phenomenological quality that I've been interested in recently, we can go right back to William James again and his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And he gives a very interesting quotation in there early on, which does a number of things. Firstly, it shows that the kinds of experiences that William James was labeling as religious experience were very broad. And this is not a traditional religious experience by any stretch of the imagination, but it does have similarities, qualities that link it to other kinds of religious experiences, as well as to other kinds of paranormal experiences. Okay, so this is the first narrative we're going to consider from William James. He says, "Quite early in the night I was awakened. I felt as if I'd been aroused intentionally, and at first thought someone was breaking into the house. I then turned on my side to go to sleep again, and immediately felt a consciousness of a presence in the room. And singular to state, it was not the presence of a live person, but of a spiritual presence. I felt also at the same time a strong feeling of superstitious dread, as if something strange and fearful were about to happen." So this is the thing that I'm interested in, this idea of superstitious dread. Okay. And one of the reasons that I'm interested in it is because it rings very closely, or resonates very closely with what theologian Rudolf Otto called the numinous. Okay, the numinous, he thought, was the essence of religious experience. It was the kind of, it's the core experience, and then different religious traditions interpret it in their different, cultural ways. Basically, what he did, he split this core experience up in his analysis into two different parts. So the numinous is not one particular thing, it's actually a combination of many different things. Okay, but he talked about in particular mysterium tremendum. Okay, a sense of horror and awe that comes about in mystical and religious experiences, as well as paranormal experiences. A lot of paranormal experiences are about horror and fear, but they're also about the mysterium fascinans, the awe and beauty and wonder that draws us in. So there's a tension within the numinous of superstitious dread, which is what was described in that previous extract, and then also the beautiful and the wonderful, okay, that attracts us in. As scary and things as paranormal things might be, they're also very kind of attractive and enticing. Okay, so he suggests that this dual sense of the numinous, of being both frightening and kind of awe-inspiring, is conjured through our interactions with what he calls the wholly other, something which has no place in our scheme of reality, but which belongs to an absolutely different one. So he says that when we encounter something, maybe alien or something that doesn't fit into our scheme of reality, something that we haven't been taught about in our cultural models maybe, then it can induce within us this feeling, this quality of the numinous, of fear, superstitious dread, and also of awe and wonder. So this is how he describes it. He says, "The feeling of it may at times come sweeping like a gentle tide, pervading the mind with a tranquil mood of deepest worship. It may burst in sudden eruption up from the depths of the soul with spasms and convulsions, or lead to the strangest excitements, to intoxicated frenzy, to transport and to ecstasy. It has its wild and demonic forms and can sink to an almost grisly horror and shuddering. It may become the hushed, trembling, and speechless humility of the creature in the presence of that which is a mystery inexpressible." Okay, so that's the numinous. This also has other kind of phenomenological resonances with what the cultural theorist Mark Fisher has called the weird. It says the weird is a particular kind of perturbation. It involves a sensation of wrongness. A weird entity or object is so strange that it makes us feel that it should not exist, or at least it should not exist here. Yet if the entity or object is here, then the categories which we have up until now used to make sense of the world cannot be valid. Okay, so people often, when they have extraordinary experiences, describe them as weird experiences. And, this is essentially what he's trying to suggest, is that these experiences arise from encounters with otherness. Similar to what H.P. Lovecraft thought. He says the true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form, clanking chains according to rule. A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint expressed with the seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. So obviously, it's a very Gothic way of framing it, but he's saying that a similar kind of thing, that we have that weird sensation of the weird arises from these interactions with the wholly other, and they can be terrifying and beautiful at the same time. People often also describe their experiences as surreal, and I think this is why I think, and I'm going to mention later on why surrealist research methods might be useful. Okay, so surrealism, defined by Andre Breton, who was the founder of surrealism, was psychic automism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express the actual functioning of thought. So he's saying that, the surreal is an expression of the functioning of thought. So when someone is explaining or describing an experience that they've had as surreal, then what they're really saying is that it seems as though, you could say, the boundaries between their subjectivity and objectivity were breaking down, that they were actually experiencing the functioning of thought in the real world. This is the philosopher Saran Alexandria, and he sort of wrote a lot about surrealism. He said that the aim of the surrealists was to reconcile reality with the illogical processes which arise in ecstatic states or in dreams. So, with the kinds of things that happen within paranormal experiences, with the aim of creating a super reality. Surrealism cannot accurately be described as fantasy, but as a superior reality in which all the contradictions which afflict humanity are resolved as in a dream. So when people describe a paranormal experience, for example, as surreal, then they're saying that it's dreamlike as well. That the boundaries between the rational and the irrational are breaking down. And if these experiences are actually irrational experiences, then perhaps we need, irrational methods to investigate. It's interesting also that, just tying this in deeper with psychical research, that Andre Breton, he obviously communicated with Freud. He was deeply interested in psychoanalysis, but he also communicated with psychical researchers like Charles Richet and Theodore Flournoy as well. Very interesting. Okay, so a truly surreal experience would be one in which the boundaries between inner and outer, subjective and objective, dream and reality blur. Other researchers have pointed this out. So Jenny Randles, for example, talks about the Oz factor. This is something that has been widely noted in alien abduction scenarios, for example. She describes it as a set of symptoms which create the impression of temporarily having left our material world and entered another dreamlike place with magical rules. It tells us, most notably, that if the percipient has changed their state of consciousness, the result is a dreamy and weirdly silent state of mind that is recognized as peculiar, even though they do not appreciate what it implies. Okay, so maybe the Oz factor, it's a phenomenological feature of many different kinds of paranormal experiences. Perhaps it's a trigger or a precondition for the experience, or maybe it's a consequence of interaction with something like Rudolf Otto or, H.P. Lovecraft would think of as the wholly other, something outside of our normal reality. Okay, so I'm going to give a couple of little examples now of narratives that were given to me, which carry these kinds of phenomenological qualitative hallmarks. Okay, so this story was sent to me by an informant who was looking for help making sense of an experience that he and a friend had had when they were teenagers, walking out the back not far from his friend's home, and this was in the United States. Okay, he says, both of us immediately saw something out of place. Below, about 30 to 40 feet away from us, in between the trees, there was something tall, white and three-dimensional. It appeared to be completely white and soft like light, but it did not illuminate the trees or ground around it. It was shaped in an upside down V or U. It was so white that you could see the shadow being cast on it while it was swaying like it was a real animal. So I've highlighted some very interesting phenomenological features here, qualities of the experience that are very interesting, and that link it into other forms of experience. So there's a lot of literature, for example, on the role of light in paranormal experiences, light behaving strangely, lights moving independently, lights that are super bright that don't seem to have any single source, all sorts of strange things. This weird swaying movement of the animal, this idea of seeing something out of place, which has been hinted at by the theorists that we've discussed. Okay, my informant goes on, he says, it was making creepy swaying movements with its whole body. It was moving left to right in a specific motion, standing on the forest floor in the same area between the trees, making absolutely no sound. This is like Oz factor ping. And there was absolutely no wind. It was beautiful to look at, but terrifying at the same time. This is the numinous. We watched it in silence as it was swaying, and I started to feel impending doom. This is the mysterium tremendum that Otto talked about. The sinking feeling in your chest set in, and it felt like I was going to die or something bad was going to happen. I told my friend specifically, I don't like this. He agreed, and we immediately left the forest. So this is, a powerful experience. We've got this very, like I was saying, very precious piece of qualitative data here, of a very extraordinary experience. And we need to treat it with the kind of respect that it deserves and think about it in these broader contexts. So where does it fit into what we already know about these kinds of processes? And there are lots of, when we do that, interesting phenomenological similarities, particular qualities of these experiences that do, intersect all of these experiences. And this is really the subject of the book I'm editing at the moment, Deep Weird, where these complex interactions actually connect with each other. Okay, and then the second experience I want to give was given to me by a student of mine a couple of years ago, who gave me permission to use this extract I asked him to write up for me. So again, another nice chunk of qualitative data. Okay, he says, I was around 7 years old when my cousin was staying over for the night. My bed was positioned to the right of the window in my bedroom, and the curtains were drawn. My cousin was reading. A strange, deep-toned voice with a kind of distorted resonance sounded from the window, capturing both our attention. My cousin told me not to go. I was too curious and slowly walked towards the window before opening the curtains. In the center of the window was a face of light. The bright light seemed to be pulsating inside of the face. It was large enough to engulf the entire center of the window. The mouth began moving and the deep, vibrating, muffled voice started to speak. I was unable to understand most of it and was too in shock to pay close enough attention. I felt locked in place during the event and was in disbelief of what was happening. My cousin jumped off the bed and we both ran downstairs. When we approached the window again, it had completely gone. So again, this is a really intense kind of paranormal experience, and it seems utterly kind of, irrational and bizarre. And yet, as you can see, I've highlighted here, there are so many interesting features of it that connect it in with other kinds of paranormal and extraordinary experiences. Okay? So this is one way that we can do this kind of qualitative psychical research, is using people's data like this, qualitative data, narratives, experiential reports and accounts, and doing a kind of comparative analysis. Okay, but perhaps we can take this even further, and that's what I want to do in the next stage. So skip forward. Okay, where we skip beyond. And this is where I want to think about different kinds of, or alternative kinds of approaches that we might be able to bring to research. So one approach, we've been talking about surrealism quite a bit, because actually surrealism, as I've said, is all about the breakdown of subjectivity and objectivity, and of allowing for the manifestation of unconscious processes to be observed. And it's really interesting that in 1924, the surrealists, led by André Breton, who we talked about earlier, established a Bureau of Surrealist Research in Paris. Okay, and here's a little extract about what they did. The promoters of the Surrealist movement, in their desire to appeal to the unconscious and to set Surrealism along the path of greatest freedom, have already begun to organize a bureau to unite all of those who are interested in expression where thought is freed from any intellectual preoccupations. And then Saran Alexandrian goes on to say that the public at large was invited to bring along accounts of dreams or of coincidences, ideas on fashion or politics or inventions, so as to contribute to the formation of a genuine surrealist archive. Okay, so I love this idea of a surrealist research institute collecting accounts of dreams and coincidences. And it's very similar kind of, data that they were collecting to what the psychical researchers were collecting back in when they set up their, their own research group in the 1880s. So some very interesting kind of overlaps here. Later on, Salvador Dali, for example, came up with some interesting kinds of ways of engaging with or engaging the unconscious mind in his art. So he came up with, for example, the paranoiac critical method. And this was, an approach that he used in order to essentially try to see the world through the mind of, or through the eyes of what he called a paranoiac, and to see connections between things that other people might not pay attention to. Okay, so Saran Alexandrian again explains that this paranoiac critical method was a spontaneous method of irrational knowledge based on the imperative critical association of phenomena. So critically associating discrete or seemingly unconnected things together. Okay, so what I'm suggesting here is that perhaps approaches that are geared towards embracing the irrational might actually be useful in some way for understanding things like extraordinary and paranormal experiences. Okay, and here's Dali's definition of painting, which I think is a really interesting one. He said that painting is actually photography by hand and in color of concrete irrationality and of the imaginary world in general. So I think this is a really interesting idea that we could perhaps collect data, through different kinds of methods that captures these irrational worlds, these imaginary worlds in different kinds of ways. And maybe art is an interesting way of doing that. It's not limited in the same ways that academic writing is. So if you look at a Dali painting, for example, there's much more in there than we would be able to say in an academic paper. Okay, but maybe we can take something from these kinds of approaches. Now, just another interesting thing here, Dali here, asleep. He used to go to sleep with a spoon balanced on his finger so that when he nodded off, the spoon would fall and it would clatter and wake him up, so that he could access his hypnagogic and hypnopompic imagery and then get it onto the canvas. So there's something interesting again about the possibility of breaking down the objective subjective kind of barrier, and of approaching paranormal research and psychical research from a very different kind of perspective. So maybe, and it's not fully fleshed out obviously, but maybe surrealist methods might be one way of doing that. Okay, there are also resonances here with the kind of participatory approach that I was talking about, of actually experiencing these things for yourself, to experience the surreal firsthand through ethnographic participation. And then there's also the issue of different kinds of knowledge and the different kinds of knowledges that are valued. So in Western, culture, scientific knowledge is often valued because it's objective, because it's reproducible and all of these kinds of things, that because you can repeat it in an experiment in a laboratory and whatever, that it's quantitative, that you can actually have numbers and you can measure and weigh things. Okay, this is the kind of knowledge that's valued. So science is understood then as a dispassionate search for objective knowledge. So science is all about going out into the world and being as objective as possible and finding quantitative data. And it implies a degree of separation between the researcher and the researched. It's saying that I'm the objective researcher investigating you, or doing research on you, okay, which is a very particular way of looking at the world. It's a very Western approach. But we can critique it with indigenous methods again, or indigenous perspectives. Okay, so ultimately, indigenous knowledge and worldviews are characterized by their relational aspects. Okay, they cannot be separated from the people, the land, spirituality, and the universe. It's this relational understanding of the world that underpins indigenous research paradigms. So while Western research paradigms are based on this idea of objectivity and of a distinction between me as the observer and the person that I'm doing the research on as the observed, indigenous perspectives don't see that. They understand the relationship exists there between me as a researcher and the person that I'm doing my research with, as a collaborative kind of co-creation. Okay, so relationality is a fundamental principle of many indigenous cosmologies. So what happens if we approach the world from that perspective? What happens if we bring, this relational ontological model to bear on parapsychology or psychical research, rather than this empirical, kind of approach? It's really much more suited to quantitative research. So I'm just going to wrap up really with some tips for the inclusion or the incorporation of these kinds of relational, maybe, or indigenous perspectives into research, just as a way of showing that it might be possible to think about these things and to approach them from very different kinds of perspectives, with different kinds of assumptions. And if we do that, then kind of a lot of the things that are problematic about the paranormal, for instance, might disappear. Because if we approach them from the perspective that, well, maybe it is possible for there to be a relationship between objective things and subjective things, or between my subjectivity and an outside world, then to have an experience that emerges in between that is not an anomaly. It's actually something that we might expect. So here are some interesting little tips, and these were aimed at researchers doing research with Indigenous Australian Aboriginal communities. But I think that the kind of lessons are more broadly applicable, and we can apply it in our ghost research, paranormal research, psychical research, whatever we want to call it. Okay, so here are some tips. Prepare well ahead of time. Getting to know the participants ahead of time will result in deeper yarning. So I should mention here that yarning is a particular Indigenous research method that comes from Aboriginal Australian tradition. To yarn is to have free-flowing kinds of conversations that can move and go on. So it's not like a structured interview, which is again a Western kind of notion that I am the researcher interviewing you. Actually, you allow for a mutual dialogue to emerge, and you can get co-created knowledge in that way. Okay, so yarning can give richer insights into research questions. In order to enable successful yarning, though, you have to befriend or engage in dialogue with an Indigenous colleague, or whoever it is that we're doing research with, or client. Develop a respectful attitude in your interaction, and you will, in almost all cases, receive a reciprocal, respectful attitude from your Indigenous colleague or client. Tell your story. Share some of your personal and professional story. It need not be a long story. In fact, most Indigenous people in Australia prefer to share small yarns of introduction and inquiry of their personal well-being in the country as their tribal language and family affiliation they belong to on first encounter with a stranger. So, establish a rapport with our fieldwork informants and treat them as, the other. Listen to their story. The process of interaction and sharing stories will begin to break down communication and social barriers between researchers and the Indigenous person. Be attentive, notice body language, tone of voice, the use of silence, and avoid the overzealous attempts of connecting with an Indigenous colleague or client, or you run the risk of stifling any success in two-way communication. So I think these are valid, useful ideas that can be brought to any kind of qualitative psychical research that we might do, interviewing our informants, or going out into the field to investigate haunted houses, remember that there are people involved and that we are also involved just in the act of being there. Okay, so these are my concluding thoughts then. Just to wrap up, I know it was a bit rambling, but I hope that there's a thread that connects it all. So first thought, qualitative research is a way of gaining insights into different worldviews and cosmologies, into subjectivities or spiritualities, different ways of making sense of our place in the world. Qualitative data, the data that we collect in this way, is challenging, but it's also precious and mysterious. Like I said, it is the product of the hard problem. It is the hard thing. It's subjectivity captured. So it's precious. It can also get very strange, and it can take us into places that we might not expect. People have very strange experiences. Okay, so what do we do with qualitative data that gets weird? Because sometimes people's experiences and beliefs can actually challenge established models. So, what do we do if people are having experiences that are, technically impossible? Well, that's what we deal with bread and butter in the parapsychological world, isn't it? And what happens if we consider their implications? So what are the implications of these experiences that people have? What are the broader implications? Maybe there are ontological implications. The tendency has been to bracket out questions of reality in the social sciences and just to focus on studying social facts or things that can be directly observed, behaviors. But actually, if we just study behaviors, if we just study the things that can be immediately observed, then we're going to lack the nuance, the experiences, beliefs, expectations, cultural biases, and things that actually underlie those behaviors. So really, we need to embrace the complexity of subjective experience in psychical research and avoid attempting to reduce it down, which is what parapsychology has really tried to do, as we've already seen, reduce it down to statistical blips. We need to understand actually subjective experience on its own terms. And if subjective experience is actually irrational, then maybe we might need, different kinds of alternative frameworks for conducting research, like surrealist research methods maybe, or indigenous research methods, which begin with very different ontological assumptions. The idea of a relational cosmos, a cosmos built around relationships and interconnections rather than discrete objects separated from each other in space. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Here are my references. And if you have any questions or you want to get in touch with me, my email address is jack.hunter@uwtsd.ac.uk. Thank you very much.